Are you ready to hear a fishing truth that might actually make you angry? What if I told you that you have been fishing entirely wrong for most of your life? Here is the absolute craziest paradox in the fishing world right now. Millions of anglers hit the water every single weekend, tie on a heavy weight, bomb their bait out to the middle of the lake, and let it sink straight into the mud. They sit there for hours getting sunburned, wondering why the fish are not biting. But here is the brutal reality. 90% of the fish in that lake are hovering right in the middle of the water column, completely ignoring your bait that is buried in the dirt. Today, we are going to talk about why you are still fishing the bottom when the vast majority of the fish are suspended mid-water. I promise you, by the end of this video, you will have a light bulb moment that will completely change how you rig up for your next trip. But before we get deep into it, I want you to head down to the comments and tell me the truth. Are you stubbornly glued to bottom fishing, or have you already figured out the mid-water secret? To understand why this is such a massive problem, we have to look back at how most of us were taught to fish. Think about it. When you were a kid, your dad or your grandpa probably handed you a rod with a heavy lead sinker and a hook on the end. The instructions were simple. Cast it out, let it hit the bottom, reel in the slack, and watch the tip of the rod. It is a tradition passed down through generations. We grew up believing that lakes are like big bowls, and all the fish just naturally sink to the floor of that bowl to eat. This belief is so strong that people will go years without catching a decent fish, and they will blame the weather, the moon phase, or the wind, rather than admitting their bait is in the wrong place. We have built an entire culture around bottom fishing. It feels safe. It feels like you know exactly where your bait is. But the science of how fish behave, how water temperatures work, and how bait fish move tells a completely different story. If you keep doing what you have always done, you are going to keep catching absolutely nothing while the guy next to you fills his cooler. Let us start by picturing a classic morning out on the water. The sun is just starting to peek over the tree line, the water is like a perfect sheet of glass, and the morning air is crisp. You get to your absolute favorite spot on the lake. Bait your hook with a juicy night crawler or a heavy jig. Cast it out as far as your arm can manage and let it sink all the way down until you feel that familiar thud in the mud. You set your rod in the holder, pour a cup of hot coffee, and you wait. And you wait some more. Maybe you talk to the guy fishing next to you, exchanging complaints about how the weather front must be putting the fish off their feed. But here is the brutal truth that hurts to hear. The fish are not off their feed today. They are just not down there in the muck where your bait is currently sitting. You are essentially playing a waiting game in a completely empty room. Think about how crazy that is. We have been conditioned to believe that fish just glue their bellies to the bottom of the lake all day. But the reality is that water is a massive three-dimensional space, and you are ignoring the biggest part of it. So let us talk about this 90% rule, because it sounds absolutely ridiculous when you first hear it out loud. How can 90% of the fish be suspended off the bottom? You have to understand that a lake is not just a bathtub filled with water. It is a complex environment with different layers, different temperatures, and different oxygen levels. The bottom of the lake, especially in the deeper sections, is often a dark, cold, and lifeless place. There is decaying plant matter, thick mud, and very little oxygen. Why would a healthy, active game fish want to spend its time suffocating in the dark mud? The answer is simple. They do not. The vast majority of the life in a lake happens in the middle and upper layers of the water column. This is where the sunlight penetrates, this is where the algae grows, and this is where the oxygen is rich and plentiful. When you send your bait rocketing past this vibrant zone of life, straight into the dark abyss, you are literally bypassing 90% of the active fish in the lake. You are fishing in a desert, hoping a stray camel walks by. Now I know exactly what some of you old school guys are shouting at the screen right now. You are aggressively typing in the comments telling me that walleye and catfish are bottom feeders, and that is why you fish down there. Let us break that stubborn myth right now. Yes, those species can and do feed on the bottom sometimes. But even the mighty walleye, the poster child for bottom bouncing, spends a massive amount of its life suspended high off the bottom. When they are actively hunting schools of baitfish, they are not dragging their bellies on the rocks. They are up in the middle of the water, cruising and looking for an easy meal. Even big flathead and channel catfish will suspend mid-water to hunt actively moving prey. If you stubbornly stick to the idea that certain fish only live in the dirt, you are severely limiting your chances of catching a trophy. It is a bitter pill to swallow, but letting go of the bottom feeder myth is the very first step to becoming a much more successful and consistent angler on any body of water. Let us dive into a little bit of lake science without making it too boring or complicated. We really need to talk about the thermocline. If you fish deep lakes in the summertime, the thermocline is the absolute most important word you can learn. As the summer sun heats the surface of the lake, the water separates into distinct layers. The warm water stays on top, and the cold water sinks to the bottom. Where these two layers meet is called the thermocline. Below this line, the water is often completely devoid of oxygen. It is literally a dead zone. If you cast a heavy weight out into deep water in the middle of July and let it sink to the bottom, your bait is sitting in water where fish physically cannot breathe. They will suffocate if they stay down there. All the fish, the bait, and the predators will stack up right above that thermocline, suspended in the middle of the water column where the temperature is comfortable and the oxygen is rich. If you are fishing the bottom in this scenario, you have exactly 0% chance of getting a bite. Picture a massive school of baitfish for a second. Think about a giant cloud of shad, shiners, or alewives swimming nervously through the lake. These tiny fish are the primary food source for almost every predator you want to catch. Do these massive schools of baitfish swim along the bottom, rubbing their faces in the mud? Absolutely not. They roam the open water, suspended in the middle of the lake, feeding on tiny plankton. And where the bait goes, the big predatory fish follow. It is the most basic rule of nature. Predators do not hang out in the mud, waiting for a stray worm to fall from the sky, when there is a massive buffet of shiny baitfish swimming 10 feet above their heads. If you want to catch the biggest, most aggressive fish in the lake, you have to put your bait where the food is. And the food is almost always suspended in the middle of the water column. When you fish the bottom, you are ignoring the natural food chain and hoping for a totally random miracle. If you have spent any time looking at modern fishing electronics lately, you already know the ugly truth about where the fish actually live. Before the invention of advanced sonar, we were all just guessing. We threw our lines out and hoped for the best. But today, with side imaging and forward-facing sonar, the underwater world is completely exposed, and the footage is absolutely undeniable. You can drive a boat over deep water and watch huge arches on the screen hovering 15 feet down in 30 feet of water. You can actually see massive schools of crappie suspended around the top of submerged trees, while the bottom beneath them is totally empty. The electronic screens do not lie. The technology has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that the old way of thinking was completely wrong. But despite seeing this evidence, so many guys will still drop a heavy jig right past those glowing red marks on the screen, letting it fall all the way to the barren bottom out of pure, stubborn habit. We all know that one incredibly stubborn fisherman. Maybe he is your uncle, maybe he is your neighbor, or maybe he is just a guy you always see at the local boat ramp complaining about his bad luck. He comes out with the same giant tackle box, filled with heavy lead sinkers he has used since the 1980s. He will sit on his bucket all day, catching absolutely nothing, while a young kid 100 yards down the bank is pulling in fish after fish using a simple slip bobber set at a mid-water depth. When you try to tell the stubborn guy that the fish are suspended high in the water, he just scoffs and says, "That is not how real fishing is done." Do not be that guy. Fishing is all about adapting to the conditions and understanding nature. The fish do not care about your traditions. They do not care about how your grandfather did it. They only care about efficiency and survival. If you refuse to adapt and target the middle of the water column, you are choosing your own ego over catching fish. But what if you do not have a fancy boat with thousands of dollars worth of glowing sonar screens? How do you find these mysterious suspended fish from the bank or from a small kayak? It comes down to basic observation. You have to start looking at the water like a detective instead of just staring blankly at your rod tip. Watch the surface of the water early in the morning or late in the evening. Are you seeing tiny splashes? That is nervous baitfish getting chased toward the surface by predators suspended below them. Watch the birds. If you see seagulls or herons diving into open water, they are targeting baitfish near the surface. That means the game fish are right there with them, pushing the bait up from the middle of the water column. You do not need expensive technology to tell you that the fish are not on the bottom. You just need to open your eyes, read the signs that nature is giving you, and adjust your rig accordingly. Let us talk about the fascinating psychology of a hungry predator. When a bass, a pike, or a walleye is suspended in the middle of the water column, they are usually in an active ambush mode. They are looking for an easy, injured target that setbacks from the school of baitfish. When your bait sinks past them and hits the bottom, it kicks up a little puff of mud, and then it just sits there, completely dead and motionless. It does not look like a struggling baitfish, it looks like a piece of debris. But when you present a lure or a bait horizontally through the middle of the water, right in their line of sight, it triggers a deep, instinctual reaction. A suspending jerkbait that pauses right in front of their face, or a swim bait swimming steadily above them, forces them to make a split-second decision. They cannot help but attack it. By targeting the middle of the water column, you are tapping into their natural hunting instincts, instead of hoping they casually suck up a worm off the mud. Here is a powerful visual to keep in mind the absolute next time you cast your line into the water. Think about the physical anatomy of a fish. Look at where their eyes are positioned on their head. For the vast majority of predatory fish, their eyes are located on the upper sides of their head. They are biologically engineered to look up and forward. They are constantly scanning the water above them for the silhouette of baitfish against the sunlight. They have a massive blind spot directly below them. When your bait is dragging in the mud and the fish is swimming even just 2 feet above the bottom, your bait is practically invisible to them. They literally cannot see it unless they turn around and point their nose straight down at the dirt. By keeping your bait suspended above the fish, you are putting it right in their optimal field of vision. You want your lure to be the dark silhouette they see when they look up towards the surface. So how do we actually break this deeply ingrained habit of dropping a heavy lead weight straight into the muck? It starts with completely changing how you rig your gear. You need to leave those giant pyramid sinkers and heavy egg weights at the bottom of your tackle box. If you are fishing with live bait, you need to lighten up your presentation drastically. You want your bait to fall through the water column as slowly and naturally as possible. A heavy weight makes a minnow plummet to the bottom like a rock. That is not natural. A dying baitfish flutters slowly downward. By using zero weight, or just a tiny split shot, you allow your bait to slowly drift through that middle zone where the 90% of fish are hanging out. That slow, natural fall gives those suspended fish plenty of time to see the bait, track it, and absolutely crush it before it ever gets close to the bottom. One of the most incredibly underutilized tools in the modern angler arsenal, especially for bank fishermen, is the simple slip bobber. So many people think bobbers are just for kids fishing for bluegill at the local pond. That is a massive mistake. A slip bobber is a precision weapon for targeting suspended fish at any depth you choose. Let us say you know the fish are hovering 10 feet deep in 20 feet of water. You simply set your bobber stop at 10 feet, cast it out, and your bait perfectly suspends exactly where the fish are waiting. It will not sink into the mud, and it will not float too high. It stays right in the strike zone forever. Whether you are using a live leech for walleye, a minnow for crappie, or a night crawler for bass, a properly adjusted slip bobber rig is often the absolute best way to catch fish that refuse to look down at the bottom. Let us talk about active retrieval and casting lures for a minute. If you are throwing swim baits or jigs, you have to master the countdown method to find these suspended fish. This is a technique that separates the professionals from the amateurs. When your lure hits the water, you start counting out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. You figure out roughly how fast your lure sinks per second. On your first cast, you count to 5 before reeling. If you get no bites, on the next cast, you count to 10 before reeling. You systematically work your lure through every single layer of the water column until you figure out exactly what depth the fish are holding at. Once you get a strike at a count of 12, you know exactly where the school is suspended. From that point on, you let it sink to 12 every single time, completely ignoring the bottom. This method is incredibly deadly and keeps you in the action all day long. Another absolute powerhouse of a weapon for targeting fish hovering in the middle of nowhere is a suspending jerkbait. If you do not have a few of these in your box, you are missing out on incredible mid-water action. A suspending jerkbait is designed to dive down to a specific depth, maybe 5 or 10 feet, and when you stop reeling, it just sits there. It does not float up, and it does not sink down. It hovers perfectly motionless in the middle of the water column, just like a stunned or dying baitfish. When the water is cold and fish are suspended but sluggish, they will not chase a fast-moving lure, and they certainly will not dig in the mud. But if you rip a jerkbait down to their eye level and just let it sit there, right in their face for 5 or 10 seconds, they will lose their minds and strike out of pure aggression. It is visual proof that mid-water presentations are superior. We absolutely cannot talk about suspended fish without mentioning the weather, because the weather dictates everything. Barometric pressure plays a massive, undeniable role in where fish position themselves in the water column. When a heavy cold front rolls through and the pressure skyrockets, fish feel that change in their swim bladders. It is physically uncomfortable for them. To relieve that pressure, they will often lift completely off the bottom and suspend aimlessly in the middle of the water. They are not necessarily feeding aggressively, but they are absolutely there, floating like ghosts. If you stubbornly fish the bottom during a high-pressure system, you are dragging your bait under millions of fish that are hovering 10 feet above the mud. You have to adapt to the sky above you. When the pressure changes, the fish change their depth, and you have to change your tactics to meet them halfway. Now let us talk about the famous drop shot rig. Most people think of a drop shot as a strict bottom fishing presentation exclusively. You have a weight at the bottom and a hook tied a few inches above it. But the drop shot is incredibly versatile if you just use your imagination. If you know the fish are suspended 3 or 4 feet off the bottom, simply make your leader longer. Tie your hook 4 feet above your weight. Now you have the advantage of keeping your line tight to the bottom for feel, but your bait is elevated perfectly into the strike zone of those suspended fish. They do not have to swim down into the dirt to find it. It is dancing beautifully right at their eye level. It is a tiny, simple adjustment to a classic rig, but lengthening that leader can be the difference between getting skunked and having the absolute best fishing day of your entire season. If you are trying to cover a massive amount of water on a big lake, trolling is quite literally one of the best ways to find these floating ghosts. But again, you cannot just drag a heavy lure through the mud. You need to use crankbaits that dive to specific depths, or use inline weights to pull crawler harnesses right through the middle layers of the water. Trolling allows you to present multiple baits at multiple depths simultaneously. You might have one lure running at 10 feet, one at 15 feet, and one at 20 feet. Whichever rod gets bit tells you exactly where the 90% of the fish are suspended that day. Once you crack that depth code, you adjust all your lines to run through that specific mid-water zone. You are no longer guessing, and you are completely ignoring the dead zone on the bottom of the lake. I want you to imagine a terribly frustrating scenario that happens every single day on lakes all across the country. An angler marks a massive school of fish on his sonar. The screen is absolutely lit up with activity. He drops his heavy jig over the side, lets it hit the bottom, and starts bouncing it. He does this for an hour and never gets a single tap. He leaves, thinking the fish just have lockjaw. What he did not realize was that the fish was suspended at 15 feet and the bottom was at 20 feet. He spent an entire hour aggressively jigging 5 feet completely underneath the fish. Because fish look up, they never even saw his bait. He was fishing below the strike zone. This happens all the time. It is a tragedy of missed opportunities. Never, ever fish below the fish. If you are going to guess on a depth, always guess higher in the water column. You will catch more fish by reeling your bait above them than you ever will dragging it below them. The specific time of year also drastically dictates just how bad this suspension problem gets. In the dead of summer, when the water surface is boiling hot, fish will suspend just below the warm layer to stay cool. In the harsh cold of winter, when the water is near freezing, fish will suspend in warmer pockets of water midway down. During the spring and fall transitions, fish are constantly moving horizontally and vertically, chasing moving bait. At almost no point during the year is the absolute bottom of the lake the most active zone. The middle of the water column is the highway. It is the grocery store. It is the comfortable living room for the fish. The bottom is just a cold, dark basement. Stop spending your entire fishing trip sitting in the basement when all the action is happening upstairs. Let us bring all of this together into a scenario that will absolutely change how you approach your very next trip to the lake. You arrive in the morning, and instead of blindly throwing a heavy weight to the bottom, you take a moment. You look at the water. You tie on a lure that you can count down, or you set up a slip bobber rig. You actively search the middle layers of the water. Suddenly, your rod bends in half. You reel in a beautiful, aggressive fish. You cast back out to that exact same mid-water depth, and boom, another strike. You have cracked the code. You have realized that the fish were there all along, they were just completely ignoring the mud. You have broken the old habits, and you are finally targeting the 90% of fish that everyone else is leaving behind. This is how you elevate your game. This is how you stop hoping for luck and start fishing with pure strategy. To wrap this all up, you have to remember the most important lesson from today. The bottom of the lake is often a desolate, lifeless desert, and dragging your bait through the mud means you are actively ignoring 90% of the fish. The real plot twist here is that the fish are not refusing to bite. They are simply refusing to look down. By lifting your bait off the bottom, understanding the water column, and presenting your lures horizontally in the mid-water zone, you tap directly into their natural predatory instincts. It completely changes the game from a boring waiting contest into an active, strategic hunt. Thank you so much for watching and hanging out with us today. If this video made you rethink your approach, please hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and join our community. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments below. What is the hardest fishing habit you have ever had to break?